I'm here today with Dr. Richard Rumelt, who is one of the world's most influential thinkers on strategy and management. McKinsey Quarterly described him as the strategy's strategist and a giant in the field of strategy. He is, of course, the author of Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, The Difference and Why It Matters, reviewed by the Financial Times as the most interesting business book of 2011. And his new book is called The Crux, How Leaders Become Strategists. And if you are watching on YouTube rather than listening on your podcast platform of choice, you may see those two books lined up in the middle distance behind him there. So very much, it's just a pleasure to have you here, Richard. Welcome to the show, for starters.
Thank you, Alison.
Great to have you. So what I was absolutely captivated by the way you introduced the concept of the crux. So if you could just tell people who haven't read it yet, where the word comes from and the connection you made between watching what was happening and the strategy position.
Well, the crux is a term used by climbers as well as other people. And it signifies the most difficult portion of a climb that somebody is doing or is trying to do. And I describe in the introduction, I used to live in Fontainebleau in France. I was teaching at INSEAD for 3 or 4 years. And I'd go for walks in the forest where the weather was nice. And the forest of Fontainebleau is very large, and most people don't even know that there are rock outcroppings there that attract boulders from all over the world. In fact, that's where bouldering was invented by Pierre Alain back in the early part of the 20th century. And there's a boulder there called Le Toit de Col de Chien, which is the roof.
You have to tell us.
The roof of the dog's ass.
Brilliant.
And it's a particularly, it's a good hard boulder type, perhaps the finest sandstone problem in the world. And it's a face about 12 feet up, and then there's a roof that comes out over your head about 4 feet, and then it goes up further from that. And finally, at the top, you're 2 stories off the ground trying to gain the top. And I can't do it. I don't think I could have done it during my better rock climbing years. It's 7A on the Fontainebleau scale. And one day I watch people fall off all the time. And, there's someone there to catch them. There's a foam pad. And, but to watch this one girl climb it and do it well was interesting. And she went through a series of moves until she comes to, she's up below the overhang, and I describe in the book how she successfully navigates that. And then I'm talking to some climbers who are coming up from southern France, and I asked them, well, why did you leave the Alps to come up here to these boulders? And one says, well, I like to climb alpine mountains. I like to climb the most interesting and challenging one where I can handle the crux. And it clicked in my mind what he was saying. He's saying he wants to do the most important or interesting climb where he can actually handle the crux. And he comes up to these boulders to get better at these hard moves. And I began to use the word crux then to describe the skills of the best strategists I've ever met. And those skills are really 3 pieces. One is a good sense of judgment about what's important. What are the important challenges they face? And the second is good judgment about what is accomplishable, what you can do, what's addressable. And that intersection there of importance and addressability begins to define the crux. The crux being, okay, here's the most interesting mountain I can climb where I can handle the crux. And I'm using the word slightly differently in the book. So I'm meaning what of the challenges you face, which one is the most important that you can actually do something about? That's the crux. And the third skill of a top strategist is the ability to focus on that. and not get distracted by 22 other issues, challenges, or things that could be done. So that's how I'm using the word in the book, and that's sort of the connection to climbing, which is really in my head more than in a practical sense. Strategists and leaders don't climb cruxes, but this intersection of the most interesting or the most important plus what you can accomplish is what the idea means.
It's a really powerful metaphor, and I want to come back to the metaphor and the way that you draw from experience and lock it into what we can already appreciate. I've got to just stay on strategy for a minute though, because I've always thought it's such an interesting concept. It's part magic, isn't it? It's got a sort of mystical aura about it. And you're interesting in the book about what it's not. So, for example, it's not about choosing a decision out of a sort of menu of selections. Why do you think it is so mysterious? And what is it? Give us a definition.
Well, it's so strategy comes to us from competition. It comes to us from war and the art of the general and the preparation of the field for battle. And going back to the Greeks, the use of the word, which actually has Indo-European roots. Stra and ag are Indo-European roots, meaning to lead or to push a broad thing. So could be cattle herding originally.
Oh, that's a really interesting etymological point. I did not know that. Thank you.
But it's creative. Because it's competitive in some sense. There's a sense of creation about it. That one of the things you want to do in a competition is not be totally predictable. And this creative sense of it is what causes people to have a problem with it. I mean, if we were to say, okay, here's a course on painting, and I'm going to give you the formula for making a great painting, or the formula for writing a wonderful piece of music, people would say, well, no, wait a minute, there's no formula for that. But somehow, if you tell a military person or a business person that, well, here's the formula for strategy, or if you say there isn't one, they kind of, well, of course there must be. I mean, it's my job. I have to do this. I've been told by the commander I have to write a strategy. So what should I do? You're told to write a popular song. What should you do? There's a creative
There's a creative aspect.
aspect.
There's a sort of temporal aspect as well, isn't there? Which I think is part of the problem, is that you don't know if it's a good strategy or not until you see what happens. And so much of that.
Even good strategies fail. Bad strategies. I got a lot of attention in writing good strategy, bad strategy. People said, and a collection of many emails saying, "Oh, thank God, somebody finally called attention to this wordsmithing and bloviation that people are calling strategy, because it's not." And it's I wondered if I was going crazy. Finally someone said, "Hey, this doesn't make any sense." So I got a lot of credit for that. So yeah, we've devolved in some sense. Partly it's so easy to write and publish nowadays compared to years and years ago, and people say all sorts of things. I, as a younger professor, used to give lectures on strategy. I remember having to do a program with the then Coopers and Lyman, and I had this map. It looked like a winding road, which displayed sort of the history of strategy. And I'm embarrassed about it now, but the history of strategy was these sets of analytical techniques, these tools.
Porter's Five Forces, all those classics of the MBA.
Yes. Whether it's the matrix or the forces, or and at some point I grew up in my late 50s and began to realize this isn't strategy. This is like saying plumbing is about pipe wrenches. No, it's not about pipe wrenches. Those are tools.
Mm.
And engineering is about, calculating. No, it's not exactly about calculating. So the strategy is about meeting a challenge. And the basic failure of strategy work is a failure to define the challenge that you're trying to meet. And people have substituted their ambitions for an actual strategy.
Standing at the bottom.
Our ambition is to entertain the world, says Disney. Well, that's not a strategy. My ambition is to be a rock star. It's not a strategy either.
There's that big sort of mess of words, and the words are problematic: strategy, vision, mission, purpose. And they do get sort of morass, don't they? But I'm drawn back to your original metaphor. I'm drawn back to somebody standing down at the bottom of the rock face, going, "My strategy is to get to the top," and you're saying, "Well, that's great. My strategy is this piton here, or those are your tools, and that's your goal. The strategy is, as you say, how you get yourself over what looks like a completely inaccessible hill."
Yes. Because if you try to get up over the overhang, you fall off because you got these two little finger holes. And you've got to arch your body back in such a way. Well, you almost need
maybe the metaphor breaks down when you get into the absolute detail of it. But let's go back to the metaphor for a second, because it's so compelling, it's so readable, and immediately you get it. And that's partly because I've done a bit of climbing as well, and you clearly have, the technical detail you go into. I think it would hold true even if you haven't done any climbing. But I was interested in the thought process that you went through, which you've sort of described to us, that kind of light bulb moment when he called it the crux, and you go, that's interesting. And B, that process by which you go, I can use this. I can help people understand the abstract ideas that I'm trying to communicate through this picture. Just tell me a little bit about how that works for you when you're writing a book.
Well, I had that image in my mind of the climbing and that connection, but my own mind doesn't clarify these things until I write or speak. So a lot of my ideas come out of my mouth. I'm talking to someone and they give me an argument, or they say something or other, and I then say something else. I reply. And then I realize what I've just said is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that happens. My wife comments on it all the time that, you're better off talking to people because then you think of new things. You don't think of them by sitting there and squeezing your head with your hands.
But you can think of them by sitting there and writing, is what you seem to say.
Writing. And so then writing, how you say something, how you phrase it, what the edgy metaphor is that's behind the words, even if you're not speaking that way. I can't write a chapter unless I have a sensibility as to what's the facts, what are the arguments I'm trying to advance, but also how does it feel? What is the tone of it? How do the words fit together? What's the melody behind the words that you're trying to, not so much trying to, that I have to find. Otherwise, the stuff just comes out in blocks, like chunky blocks. It's unreadable. You have to go back and find what my wife Kate calls your voice. You found your voice, and okay, now you can make this argument because you found the place to stand where you can make it. But it's also the place to stand where you can think it.
I'm interested in that. Would you use feel? How does it feel? Because you seem to be saying that there's the mental process, there's the thought behind it, and there's the way it feels on the page as you read it or as you write it, that there's a sense of, almost a somatic sort of sense of how you're writing. Just tell me a little bit more about what you mean by how it feels, as much as how you're communicating an idea.
That's hard. I don't know.
I know, that's why I want to know more about it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, there's a set of themes that one is trying to capture, and you have the idea that you're going to emphasize this point about focus. And I remember a story. I remember being at camp and learning to focus a magnifying glass, the sun, on a piece of paper, and the counselor telling me it had to be on a dark fiber, not a white fiber. It wouldn't burn. I was trying to burn things. I'm an 8-year-old boy. You're always trying to burn
Of course you are.
And that what does focus mean? Well, it means that. And then what else does it mean? So I'm trying to write about focus. And focus is the most difficult concept in strategy. It is the core of strategy. It is the single word that describes most successful strategies. And in military terms, you focus your strengths on the opponent's weaknesses. And sometimes through surprise, sometimes through analysis, one way or another. What does focus really mean? What does it mean in a more abstract sense, focus for a company like IBM? What do we mean by focus? And I'm trying to deal with that. I know that focus is important, and I know that it's hard when we get to complex organizations. And I'm trying to find a way to express that through both stories and prose. And in the process, I learn what focus means. Because I want to make an argument that focus is really important. But then you get to a company like IBM and you can't say it's focused. It's all over the place. So then, well, am I wrong that focus is important? And I have to sort it out. And I realize, well, what's important is focusing on the critical challenge you're facing today. That it isn't like the company has a total focus, but the senior management team has to decide where their energy is going to be focused. And they can't focus on 22 different things. It doesn't work. And so they have to decide on what is the critical issue they're facing that deserves this focus. You see it in national governments where they can't decide what's important. Is it the climate? Is it defense? Is it medical care? Is it what? And they don't focus on anything, so they don't get anything done.
So,
this is mysterious property of focus, and I think it has to do with hierarchy.
So for you as the writer, as you're grappling with that, and I know exactly what you mean, there's an idea there, it's important, but how do you articulate it, and how do you get it across without killing it with all the qualification? And
part of it is the idea changes. The process of getting it across, if you're honest with yourself and you're really trying to get the idea across, the process of trying to explain it modifies it. Because you realize that aspects of what you were thinking are not true or they're not arguable. And so you have to change your thesis a little bit.
I would think this is one of the best reasons for writing, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, you write in order to be clear.
Yeah.
When I left the university finally 4 or 5 years ago, students couldn't write. It's depressing. It was difficult. They've lost that training. The educational establishment. Now, this is a whole nother lecture on a different subject, but they want to believe that education is about someone who knows something standing up there and blah, 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 telling you, which is not. That's not education. Education is where you do something and an educated person then tells you what you did wrong or what you did right and gives you some coaching. But if you don't do something, you can't get educated. You can't just listen. Go anywhere.
We're reinventing Kolb's kind of reflective practitioner sort of learning diagram, aren't we? You have to do it, you have to talk about it, you have to write about it, you have to think, you have to go take that back in. And that's one of the most exciting things.
Bureaucracies all operate in a fundamentally similar way, whether it's teachers or bureaucrats or is particularly white collar workers. They change the production methods to make themselves more comfortable and to make themselves seem more important to the thing so that they can't be fired. But yeah, so I mean, education is now taken over by teachers who redefine it in a way that they prefer, that's much more comfortable for them than the actual stressful actual education.
And you could say the same about business as well, couldn't you? The messiness of that.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on something that you wrote in the introduction. One of the things that really struck me about this book was how articulate you are, particularly in the introduction, about the way that you write, which is why I've been pressing you on some of those aspects. I thought it was so fascinating. And one thing that really struck me, and I know that people struggle with this when they're writing business books, is the way that you balance your own opinion with research, with fact, and how you present those things. And you are just completely unapologetic about using I. And I just wanted to, because I think it's great. I use the first person to explain how I've come to know and believe certain things. These things are often not facts or logical arguments. They're conclusions and views I've developed over a lifetime of work. And it's beautifully written. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. But actually, it's very profound because owning that, because this is not a research document, it's not evaluating the literature, it is very much, here's what I've concluded from my experience. And owning that, I think, is really important.
Part of my voice that I had to discover in order to write this kind of book.
So if somebody's struggling to do that, what would you tell them?
Well, you have to separate out the part of your writing that's discursive and the part that's from you. It doesn't all have to be I, but I find it helpful to do that. When I wrote research papers, mathematical models, and statistical stuff, of course, you don't do that too much, although I do it more than some other people would. Because I appears there. I decided to do it this way.
It speaks a certain confidence in your opinion, doesn't it?
Yeah, you have to. I mean, you have to have a confidence in your opinion because it's all about opinion, particularly if you're writing business books. It's about your opinions about things, mainly. If you're writing history, you shouldn't do that because you weren't there. Unless it's a kiss and tell book about my day in the Trump White House or something. But in general, if I'm writing stuff about what I think and what I've learned over the years, that's what I learned. Mm-hmm. It's not what other people have learned. This is what I see. This is my experience. And unfortunately, you can't deduce management practice or strategy from some fundamental principles. It's not a deductive science. You can't say, well, here are the axioms, like Newton's laws, and then from that we can figure out the strength of a bridge. No, it doesn't work that way.
And there's a generosity to the reader there as well. I think it's important because you acknowledge that actually, if this is my opinion, then yours may be different. Your experience is different.
Well, you owe it to the reader, if you're going to say I, to explain how you acquired that little chunk of wisdom, that little chunk of opinion. But sometimes you skip over that a little bit. But it's if you're being a little flippant about it. But really, there's a reading we used to have at Harvard Business School when I was a doctoral student by a guy named Charlie Gregg, and it was called Because Wisdom Can't Be Told. And it was about why we'd use the case method.
Why we use the
case method of instruction. Why we study cases. And it's because, according to Charlie Gregg, and he was right about the old case method, and it's because you learn by both discussing something and having your ideas conflict with those of other people and having to defend yourself. And that's how you get wise about something. You don't get wise because someone lectures you about it. here's the right way to think. You learn which ways of thinking survive arguments with others. And that's sort of what case method originally was about. Increasingly, it's about, someone's economic theory and trying to illustrate it with a case example. But how do you communicate something you've learned over 50 years? That strategy is problem solving, that it's not a plan. Well, I can't say as a fact that's true, because if you go and look at other people's books and writings, they say it's a long-term plan. And so I have to bolster why I think that's wrong and why I think what's right. Now, I'm an unusual business writer in that I spend time on what's wrong.
Mm.
Most people don't do much of that. The business press certainly doesn't ever criticize a company unless they failed. They never say, well, that's a dumb move beforehand. Merging Chrysler and Daimler-Benz. Oh, that's, they always play it up until it fails. And so they have no principles whatsoever about how things ought to be or should work or anything. And part of being an expert in management strategy is having some ideas about how things ought to be. You're getting me to run on here.
I'm going back to that idea. The thing about case theory reminds me of again, I'm coming back to the image of climbing, is that, every climb's different. You can't just take a sort of, plan for one climb and apply it to another. But you can take the principles and you can see similarities and you can adapt.
And there's skills of how to climb, how to handle this kind of move versus that kind of move. You can practice those.
Yeah,
and get better at them. And another metaphor I use in the book is that strategy is a journey.
Mm.
And this translates into the climbing metaphor again, in that, you start off climbing up the side of a pretty big mountain and you think, well, I think I'll go up that crack to that ledge and then we'll see. You get to the ledge, and where you thought you could keep going, now you can't. You have to traverse to the right and try something else, and so on. And it's a journey, unless you're following a guidebook.
Yeah, and the map is not the territory.
Right, and yet there's literally hundreds of authors out there that say a strategy is a long-term plan.
Mm.
It's a vision of where you want to be. I probably annoy some of my colleagues at Stanford by saying, their idea that first establish your long-term goals and then develop your strategy. And I say that's ridiculous. Where did these long-term goals come from? Where they just appeared in front of your phone? This is silly.
Especially these days. Long-term goals feel laughable at the moment, don't they?
Well, and we get in the business world, and particularly in the strategy world, people got distracted by economics.
Mm.
Economics is a fascinating subject, but economists have made it approachable for themselves by making these assumptions that everybody has a utility function, a value, and that you want to maximize that. And so firms want to maximize profit, or they want to maximize value, and then what should they do to do that? And it's simply not true. It's not the way humans are built. People have multiple ambitions.
I always ask guests to recommend a book, and I've got this lovely, slightly mischievous sort of desire for you to recommend books that you don't like, going on the sort of negative data principle, because I'm sure there could be loads and loads of them, but I better not. So I'm going to ask you to recommend a book that you think people should read, apart from your own, obviously. What books do you think are really interesting?
I'm a big fan of history. And if you feed me a few drinks, I'll say that history is the only valid social science. The rest are bunk. But that's too strong a statement. But I like books about things that happened. or books that come from real expertise. If it's about strategy, this is old now, but I loved Andy Grove's book, Only the Paranoid Survive. He was a genius, and the book is about an incredibly important set of issues of detecting an inflection point when the world changes. The hinge of history suddenly.
Well, it may be an old book, but it sounds very timely.
The good books are timely forever.
Yeah, brilliant.
Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs is wonderful.
Yeah, it's a classic biography, isn't it?
I like about management. Management's a hard subject. Linda Hill's written the best book about management. It's called On Becoming a Manager. Yeah. And she actually gets into what it's like to be first made into a manager and sort of the stages of discomfort and learning that one goes through. The transactional management first, trying to deal with 8 different people, and then gradually learning to lead the group rather than each of 8 people, and the stages of learning that take place. Just excellent, really. I love Sir John Kay's book, Obliquity. It's a subject that nobody is able to tackle. I'm afraid to tackle it. But it's the truth. The truth is you don't accomplish something by trying to accomplish it directly, typically. It's certain things, if you're, okay, I'm a little old now, I'm almost 80, but, if you're on a date and you're thinking to yourself, I wonder how I'm coming across. I hope she likes me. The answer is no, you're not coming across.
If you have to ask the question.
Yeah, you have to ask the question. It's stupid. That if you have to think about something, think about, what is she saying that's interesting? And I don't know. The more you think about your objective there, the more you undermine it. Brilliant. And the more you think about, I want to make money. I want to make money. I want to make a lot of money. Geez, how can we make more money? The more you lose track of the basics of business, which is to create value for someone, and to do it using something you know about rather than accounting or financial engineering. And, so obliquity is just an incredibly important idea that's very hard to get precise about. I like John Kay's book.
Wonderful. I'm going to stop you there because I think we could probably talk about the books you would recommend all day. And part of me just wants to do that, but I'm going to have to stop. But thank you for those recommendations. And obviously the transcript of this conversation, all those recommendations will be up on the show notes at extraordinarybusinessbooks.com. But Richard, before we go, if people want to find out more about you, more about your books, where should they go?
Well, there's a website coming up about the book, and that'll be attached to a blog. I think the website's called thecruxbook.com, and it's almost published.
Well, by the time this goes out, it will be there. So I will put that link up and people can go find it there. It's been such a pleasure talking to you about climbing and strategy and everything. It's been wonderful. Thank you for your time today. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for the interview, Alice.